This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a Middle East scholar at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev and the author of a new book entitled The Secret Anglo-French War in the Middle East, Intelligence and Decolonization, 1940 to 1948. It has just been published in English by Routledge, and it analyzes, among other things, the role of the British intelligence in dictating imperial policies in the very final days of the British presence in the Middle East. Professor Meir Zamir, welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So focusing on the role of the British intelligence rather than Great Britain as a whole suggests that the intelligence and the government didn't necessarily work in tandem. In fact, one of the main findings of your research is that the intelligence undermined the stated policies of the British government in those years. Tell us a bit about it. How did it come about?
Well, maybe two kind of definition. First, when we talk about the intelligence, it's a very large kind of, very general kind of definition. There were in the Middle East over 20 various agencies, British intelligence agencies. So we are really speaking on particular part of this intelligence British community. We are speaking about people on the spot, the agents who were running, actually, who were supposed to implement decision and policy taken by the government in London. In reality, they had their own game to play. Now, this is not much different than the First World War, which is far more known. You know, the whole story of Lawrence and the Arabists and the way that they were playing with British, implementing British policy on the spot. The only difference is that in the Second World War, not much known of these Arabists, of these intelligence officers. So when we talk about that, we are talking about kind of a dual policy. There is this official policy, which you can follow it by the government, by the Foreign Office.
Which was the gradual decolonization of the Middle East.
Absolutely. The whole policy that decisions were taken in London by the cabinet, and it was supposed to be implemented on the ground by the diplomat, by the military officer, by the intelligence.
We're talking about the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, right?
This is the period of the Cold War, the early part of the Cold War. So this is really what is the formal policy, which is very much known. Historians go to the archives and they uncover these documents and write the history of British decolonization of the Middle East in the 40s, early 50s. But on the same time, there was another policy, a policy that was implemented by what I called agent on the spot, agent in the field, which very often had their own agenda in trying to influence the policy of their government.
And what was that? They just refused to see the end of British presence in the Middle East? They saw it as undermining British interests in the world?
Look, first we have to make quite clear, diplomats and officials on the spot had the role to convince their government in certain policy. They send the information, they write recommendation and report and try to influence. We are not talking about that. This is the formal way. Yes? We are talking about something else, something that's much more
I mean, that they played a proactive role in undoing the government policies
or running a policy that the government was not aware of it.
Mm-hmm. Such as, so you focus. One of the actors in your book is Illtyd Clayton.
Yes, but before we come to that, you have to understand something, that the general kind of background, we are speaking about the time where the Labour government was elected from 45 onwards. Most of these agents in the field, we are talking about these intelligence officers, some of these diplomats, distrust this government. Moreover, there was a notion that a third world war is very, very imminent against the Soviet Union. Exactly.
So is this what really dictated their activism, saying that if Britain withdraws from the Middle East, the Soviet Union would fill the void?
In a way, that was the idea. In a way, they were thinking about the late 30s, when Britain was caught unprepared for war against Germany. And they were determined not to repeat this mistake again. Now, the Labour government declared policy was decolonization, including evacuating Palestine. What they were trying to do, they were trying to ensure the British strategic interest in this area in one way or another, whether with their knowledge of their government or without the knowledge of their government, the cabinet in London.
But what did they see as the British strategic interest in the Middle East?
Their most important, really, at that time was to ensure, first, defense treaties with the Arab states, which in case of war, they will be able to use the Middle East as they used it in the Second World War. Of course, the usual thing, the oil, the Suez Canal, the resources, the natural resources of this area. They had to face, on the one hand, the nationalist movement, which were demanding independence and the evacuation of the British forces, particularly in Egypt. On the other hand, they wanted to remain in this, to stay there.
So the Arab national government saw any bilateral agreement with the British government as some sort of condoning the extension of British imperialism in the Middle East. They refused to do any dealings with the British government out of hand.
Well, here's the problem. When you talk about the Arab nationalists and you talk about the Arabs, there is a difference here between the leadership and the general population, particularly the younger generation. One of the ways that the British agents were able to work out their policy, their covered policy, I'm using the term covered empire, namely, on the one hand, to evacuate the Middle East, on the other hand, to be able to retain the British interest there in a kind of covered empire. One of the ways that they were able to operate whereby enlisting political elite, and which I call agent of influence. So you find Arab nationalist leader, well known. Supposedly they were fighting the British. In reality, they were secretly collaborating with the British. For instance...
Is the best known example King Abdullah of Jordan?
No, the Hashemite is very known. They were pro-British. They collaborated with the British.
Overtly. It wasn't,
yes,
it wasn't a double game.
There is nothing new about that. This is, of course, very much known. But we are not talking about these leaders. We are talking...
but were the British trying to extend the Hashemite model to other countries in the Middle East?
Yes. In a way, yes. But let me give you some kind of example. Of course, you are not maybe familiar with the name or listener, but people like the Lebanese Prime Minister, Riyad al-Sulh, a non-nationalist who led Lebanon for independence from France, and he was very, very, very much involved in the war of 1948. Now, you find that he collaborated with the British intelligence. Or somebody like Jamil Mardam, who was the Syrian prime minister at that time. Again, you find evidence that he collaborated with the British intelligence,
But that,
and
of
so
course,
on
was
and so
all
forth.
very secret because they feared the backlash from public opinion.
Exactly. But here's really the most important discovery or the nuts of this book. This book was it was impossible to write this book before I uncovered the Syrian document and the secret British document in French archive. Mm-hmm. If you want to write about British intelligence role in the Middle East based on British sources, Israeli sources or American sources, you really can't do much. Mm-hmm. Because British intelligence like the MI6 or the SOE destroyed most of their document on this area. Mm. So, and whatever left, you can't really...
Because it was such a sensitive episode?
Exactly. That was a habit that they did. Mm. Now, if you want to look at the role of the British intelligence in the Middle East...
It has to come from a third
particularly
party.
the covert action, the covert operation, you can't find it in British. Now, what I did something else. I went to the French archive, and there I found... actually the evidence. I think we better talk a little bit about the evidence because this is really the roots of all this work. Now, it's very kind of simple. General de Gaulle, after the war, accused the British of being responsible for expelling France from Syria and Lebanon, which was part of the French mandate. Mm-hmm. Now, the historian went to the archives, both British and French, and they never found any evidence for de Gaulle accusation. Okay? Mm-hmm. I thought I should look again why de Gaulle was so determined, including in his memoir, that the British were responsible for expelling France. Okay? Mm-hmm. And after years of looking around, in French archive, I found the document. Why de Gaulle was accusing the British. What I found is something very interesting. The French intelligence in Beirut was able to recruit an agent, a top-level agent, in the Syrian government. From the summer of 1944 until late 1948, this agent sent thousands of documents, Syrian document, Arab document to the French intelligence, which they translated into French and sent it back to Paris.
He was a turncoat, a double agent?
No, he wasn't. He was an official. He was recruited.
Right.
Now, at the same time, the French intelligence in Beirut was able to recruit another agent in the British consulate in Beirut. This agent was able to provide them with a secret document of the operation of the British secret services in the Middle East.
But what were these operations that, according to General de Gaulle and the new evidence that you've found, that have actually brought about the expulsion of France from the Middle East? What did the British do
That's a good question, because these agents on the field, they were determined to rectify a two mistakes that they thought that the British government committed in the First World War or after the First World War. These two mistakes were giving Syria and Lebanon to France, and secondly, undertaking to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. Mm-hmm. What they were determined to do, whether their government agree or not, to rectify those two mistakes. Right. And the first one they managed, namely, in the summer of 1945, they manipulated, actually, and they played a double game with these agents of influence, namely with Lebanese and Syrian nationalist leader, and they were able to expel the French from Syria and Lebanon. From their point of view, that was the first step to establish what they were thinking in terms of Greater Syria, namely, and this has something to do with the present situation. They were convinced that Iraq, which was established by the British after the First World War, is a very vulnerable state.
They were right.
Actually, they were thinking about the minorities there. Mm-hmm. They were thinking about the Shiites. Now, the top leader, the Hashemite, and particularly the Prime Minister at the time, Nouri Said, in Iraq, they were convinced that that is the case. Mm-hmm. What they were thinking is establishing some kind of federation or confederation which kind of encompassing Iraq together with Syria and together with Jordan and part of Palestine. This is what they were looking for.
Again, under a British umbrella.
Of course.
Yeah.
They were talking in terms of the Middle East is a kind of, they were thinking about, you have a lot of various players. Think about orchestra. Okay? But this harmonic orchestra, you have all sorts of leaders, all sorts of division, a tribal rivalry. You have Ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia and King Farouk and the Hashemite and then Syria and all that. And what they were thinking was to somehow, even as the process of decolonization was there, to try and organize the Middle East in a way that it will run according, let's say, a British partitura.
And a huge thorn in their sides on the way to implementing this grand plan was the existence of a Jewish state in Palestine. And also, as part of this conniving strategic planning, part of what the British intelligence did was to stoke active resistance in the Arab governments against the imminent establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, with the vote in the UN on the partition plan, etc., in the mid to late 40s.
Yes. Here again, there is the Syrian document allow us for the first time access to Arab document uncensored. And what you discover is something very interesting. The whole question of Palestine and Jewish state was not the most important question for the Arab leadership. I'm not talking about the Arab populace. Mm-hmm. For the Arab leadership, it was not the most important. Actually, we have the tendency to see ourselves always in the center of event, but we were not at that time. From the point of view of the British, the most important, really, issue was to ensure their defense treaty and their presence in the Arab states. In the Arab themselves, there was a division between the various Arab leaders and families, the monarch of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the Hashemite. The whole question of Palestine was part of that. It was not the most important issue. It was played as the most important issue, but it was a secondary.
So why did the British intelligence officers, I mentioned Iltud Clayton earlier, he played an instrumental role in this. Why did they turn the British leaderships against Palestine if it wasn't an issue?
Let's make it clear. All these people, including Bevin and others, didn't think
the foreign minister.
Yes, didn't think that establishing Jewish states according to partition plan is a viable solution or of its British interest. So they oppose it anyway. Mm-hmm. There was we don't have to think that the British were, very, very...
But there's a difference between thinking it's not a viable solution to threatening British interests in the Middle East.
What they were thinking is something else. They were thinking to use the Arab-Israeli conflict in order to achieve other more important goals, strategic goals from their point of view. We can now, with the help of the Syrian and British document, and with the help of the French intelligence report, who are following all this, we can actually establish the whole process of the British intelligence conspiracy from July 1947 until May 1948.
But do you think that the British meddling was instrumental in driving the Arab leaderships into the state of Israel straight after its establishment in May 1948?
Absolutely. if you read the Syrian document, if you read the correspondence between the Arab leaders, you find out that most of the Arab leaders were not willing to go to war in Palestine. Neither Farouk nor Ibn Saud, for instance. Even the Syrian leadership was very much, very careful. But what you find here is something more interesting, is how, in what I called covert political action, how these agents on the field, the British intelligence agents, how they were playing their game, how they were trying to provoke, on the one hand, the Arab leadership into war in Palestine, on the other hand, misleading their government or their cabinet of what they were doing.
Yeah.
Now we have to say something important about another part of this book, which is the secret collaboration between the French intelligence and Ben-Gurion. Now, if you try to find out why the British conspiracy didn't work out, it's because Ben-Gurion and some close associates, some close people who worked with him, were very much aware. And here's another discovery of that.
So they knew that the British were working against them in real time.
It is kind of important. If you interesting. If you read what Ben-Gurion was saying before the 48 war and after that, he repeatedly accused the British of provoking the Arab to invade the state of Israel. Now, as it happened with de Gaulle, historians went to the archive to find evidence to Ben-Gurion accusation. And of course, they didn't find anything in British archives or others. So what kind of conclusion? When you can't find evidence, sometimes it's trying to go to psychological explanation. And here, as in the case of de Gaulle, they decided that,
He had some unexplained hatred of the British.
He was Anglophobic, just as de Gaulle. Now, when you start looking at the French material, you find something very interesting. Shortly after, the French agent, the French intelligence in Beirut, was able to play this major, breakthrough when they recruited these agents. Ben-Gurion came to Beirut in October 1944, met the French delegate, General Paul Benet, and from then onwards you can see how Ben-Gurion was in close collaboration, and some of his associated with the French intelligence, getting all the material of what the British intelligence were doing. And that was the case until 48-49. They were getting actually, the sense, the document, or whatever the British or the Arab leadership were doing. And this is really the very interesting thing.
Absolutely. One of many, many interesting discoveries and arguments in your new book, Professor Meir Zamir. It's called The Secret Anglo-French War in the Middle East, Intelligence and Decolonization, 1940 to 1948. Just came out in English, was published by Routledge. I'm afraid this is all we have time for. So thank you very much for coming in. This was very, very interesting. Thank you very
much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye and Shana Tova.
We share this land forever, but we never looked around to see. We coexist for years with desert people. We are dreamers.